Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum viewers. In this video we will be discussing a poem, A Fara Cry from Africa, which is written in 1962. The writer of the poem, Derek Walcott, has written this poem about a Mau Mau uprising in Kenya. It was a war that was fought between native Kenyan people against British colonists. And this war was fought between 1950 to 1960. There is a speaker in this poem who says different thing about war and about his identity. And the speaker has two ancestries. He is from Africa as well as from an English ancestry. He feels confusion about his alliance because he is against both the countries or both the colonial power, those who play or who exercise the colonial power, and those who are the victim of this colonial power and who are in revolt against this colonial power. Both are killing people for their own purposes. So the speaker of this poem communicates this intense agony of his heritage and inheritance in a very beautiful manner in this poem. Let's talk about the summary of this poem. When you read the poem, there are different stanzas in this poem. The first stanza, which is about the war, the dead bodies, and its effects. Then there is a second stanza, which is about the wildlife, the beasts, the animals, and their comparison to human beings. The third stanza is about the brutality of the people in this war. In this last stanza, the poet has also talked about his identity and his confusion. He is unable to take the side of any nation in this war. So let's start the summary of each and every stanza. The first stanza. The poem begins in this first stanza by describing a scene of war in Africa, where the poet says that the dead bodies are scattered around in the battlefield, and a worm is there who cries not to sympathize with the people who are already dead. He also talks about scholars and statistics, those people who are statisticians, and these scholars and statisticians, they are stick to the colonial policy and they justify this war and they justify these dead bodies as facts and figures. They present this brutality in the form of facts and figures. So it is not a human killing in their eyes. It is just like numbers. These many people are killed and these many people are killed in this war. In this very stanza, the poet also talks about a white child that has been killed in his bed, and he compares this very violence with the violence that was done against the Jews. This is the first stanza. In the second stanza, the poet talks about the wildlife, the beasts, the birds, the animals, and he says that these animals and beasts, they are in constant struggle to fight each other, to exercise their power, to dominate each other. And the poet says that it is a custom of a forest, a jungle, to fight for the power, for the dominance. He further says that animal killing for food and for power is one thing. It is natural. But it is not acceptable that human beings start killing, start violence against each other, and they call themselves creatures of divine. So in a way, the poet highlights the difference between the animals and the human beings, and he says that there is no difference. Both the beasts and the human beings, they kill each other, they inflict pain on each other. He also talks about human beings as the more brutal or the more violent than the animals, because they call themselves the sublime creature on this earth. They are not animals, still they are acting like animals. And he talks about that the native people, they are killing the white people and they think that it is sign of courage. But this courage creates a kind of fear in them because it is a constant war. And this is the second stanza. Now the third stanza, the last stanza of the poem, is about the brutality of the white and the native Kenyans. The speaker of this poem, or the poet, he compares this war in Kenya to the Spanish Civil War. The war is just like a gorilla wrestle with Superman, where the gorilla is compared with the natives and the Superman is compared with the white man. The poet talks about himself and he says he has connections to both these nations. He is a British as well as African. He is unable to decide to turn to whom or to divide his blood into two. He openly curses the British officers for their brutality and violence. He is unable to choose between Africa and English. The English, the language in which he writes poetry. The poet, in the end, questions himself that should he leave them both or should he support them for their violence and brutality. He again questions himself that how should he see all this violence and brutality and how should he stay calm in this situation. He asks how he can turn away from Africa and keep living. This was a brief summary or a kind of analysis of this poem. There are some major themes in this poem. The first one is obviously the violence. It is one of the major themes of this poem because the poet condemns this violence caused by African as well as British. He has double heritage and he is confused between the two nations. So he is a kind of victim of identity crisis, which is another very interesting theme in this poem. Then this identity crisis is because of the post-colonial power exercise in this poem. He is against British because they are fighting war or they are dominating the native Kenyans. He is also against Kenyans because they are killing white British. So he is against all kind of violence. Another theme can be cruelty and brutality, which is very much related to violence. And the poet is against every kind of brutality caused by colonialism. And he condemns the British for their cruelty and ruling people forcefully. And this is the essence of colonialism. They occupy a place and they have occupied places and they have dominated people by force. Culture clash can be another theme in this poem, where two cultures, they are in constant struggle to dominate each other. One is the native culture of African and the other is the British culture. Both cultures are violent towards each other. So this poem is a post-colonial poem and it has a great significance when we talk about exercising colonial power, subjugating the native people, killing cultures and people, and how white and imperialist nations occupied different places in the world. Thank you so much.